It was a Friday night like any other. My parents, Jason and Violet, had gone out to dinner with friends, leaving me alone in our suburban home. I, Maya, a 13-year-old girl with brown hair and freckles, was excited at the idea of staying up late. The clock struck almost midnight, and I was still glued to the screen of my computer, enjoying the temporary freedom. My desktop faced a large window that looked out onto the backyard. The curtains were open, revealing the darkness outside. I didn't mind. After all, who would be watching me at this time of night? Connected to MSN, I was chatting animatedly with several online friends, some of whom I had never met in person. The house was quiet, except for the occasional sound of cars passing by in the distance and the gentle noise of the wind outside. The glow of the computer screen was the only light in the dark room, creating shadows that danced on the walls. I felt a slight chill but ignored it, continuing to type enthusiastically. Suddenly, a message from one of these virtual friends, a certain Dark Shadow 45, left me cold. "Hey Maya, was that peanut butter sandwich you ate an hour ago tasty?" I froze. How could he know this? I hadn't mentioned anything about the snack I'd made earlier. Before I could respond, another message appeared. "You should have been more careful with that soda cup. You almost spilled it on your keyboard." My heart began to race. It was impossible for anyone to know these details, unless... A shiver ran down my spine as realization hit me. Slowly, I lifted my eyes to the small green light next to the webcam above my monitor. It was on. All this time, someone had been watching me, invading my privacy, turning my solitary night into a terrifying experience. My fingers trembled over the keyboard as I stared at the screen, unable to respond. Dark Shadow 45's messages kept coming, each one more disturbing than the last. "Your expression right now is priceless, Maya. You look like you've seen a ghost." The mockery in his words was palpable, heightening my terror. I swallowed hard, tasting the bitter flavor of fear. My mind raced, trying to process the situation. Those mysterious stories of isolation that I used to read online had suddenly become my reality. I was living my own scary tale of loneliness, trapped in a digital trap that I had helped create. With shaky hands, I turned off the webcam and covered it with a piece of tape that I found in the drawer. But this did little to ease my anxiety. Dark Shadow 45's words echoed in my mind. "Too late, dear. I already have everything I need." A chill ran down my spine as I wondered what everything could mean. I nervously glanced at the window behind me, wondering if he could be out there, watching me. The darkness seemed denser, more menacing. Every shadow in the backyard transformed into a sinister figure in my overactive imagination. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that it was just a hacker, someone sitting behind a computer miles away, but the feeling of violation, of having my safe space invaded, was overwhelming. With my heart pounding, I decided I couldn't just sit there, victimized. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, and turned my attention back to the screen. Dark Shadow 45's messages kept coming, each one more provocative than the last. "What's the matter, Maya? Cat got your tongue?" he taunted. Gathering all the courage I could muster, I began to type. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" I sent the message, my fingers trembling on the keyboard. The response came almost instantly. "Oh, now she speaks. I'm just having a little fun, dear. There's nothing wrong with watching, is there?" I felt a surge of anger mixing with my fear. This wasn't just one of those scary stories of isolation I used to read. It was real, and I was at the center of it. "This isn't fun," I replied. "It's an invasion of privacy. It's illegal." Dark Shadow 45 seemed to find this amusing. "Illegal? Maybe. But who's going to stop me? Your parents? They're not even home. The police? They'll never find me." His words were like daggers, each one deepening my sense of helplessness. But then, something inside me snapped. I refused to be the helpless victim in this scary tale of loneliness. I took a deep breath and remembered something my older brother, a tech enthusiast, had taught me once. He had shown me how to identify IP addresses in case of emergencies. This gave me an idea. "You're wrong," I typed, my hands now steady with determination. "I can stop you. I'm tracing your IP address right now, and I will report you to the authorities." There was a long and agonizing pause after my last message. The digital silence was deafening, amplifying each passing second. Finally, a response appeared. "You wouldn't dare." The confidence in his tone had diminished, replaced by a note of uncertainty. I seized this opening, feeling a rush of adrenaline coursing through my veins. "I already have," I lied, feigning a confidence I didn't possess. "The cyber police are tracking you down as we speak. It's over." Dark Shadow 45. The following minutes were a whirlwind of emotions. Dark Shadow 45 went offline abruptly, leaving me in a tense silence. My heart was still racing, but now with a mix of fear and triumph. I had faced my virtual tormentor, and somehow it seemed I had won. At that moment, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. My parents had arrived. I ran to the door, eager to tell them what had happened, to seek comfort and security after this night of isolated terror. As I recounted my experience to my shocked parents, I realized that this night had changed me. I was no longer just a naive girl surfing the web. I had faced one of my biggest fears and come out stronger. Those mysterious stories of isolation that I used to read now held a new meaning for me. That night, before going to bed, I covered all the cameras in the house with tape. It was a physical reminder of the lesson I had learned. In the digital age, constant surveillance is not just fiction, but a scary reality we must confront. As I lay down reflecting on the events of the night, I realized that I had lived through my own scary story of isolation. But I had also discovered an inner strength I didn't know I possessed. The shadows in my room no longer seemed so threatening. I knew that even when alone, I wasn't helpless. The night that started as a horror story ended as a tale of empowerment. And although I knew the virtual world still held dangers, I felt prepared to face them. With this comforting thought, I closed my eyes, ready for a well-deserved sleep after a night I would never forget. My name is Emma, and that October night will forever be etched in my memory. The air was heavy with the crisp chill of autumn, and dry leaves performed a macabre dance in the wind outside. My parents had gone out for dinner with friends, leaving me alone in our isolated house on the outskirts of town. Usually, I relished these nights of solitude, but something felt different this time. Curled up on the living room sofa, I tried to focus on the pages of my favorite novel, but my mind kept wandering. The silence of the house was broken only by the monotonous tick-tocking of the old wall clock and the occasional howl of the wind. I struggled to shake off the sense of unease growing in my chest, attributing it to the remnants of the chilling stories I had recently read. As the night progressed, I began to notice subtle sounds that had gone unnoticed before. The creaking of the floorboards, the rustling of curtains, the snapping of wood contracting in the cold. Each noise seemed amplified in the sepulchral silence of the house. I wondered if this was how those spine-chilling stories I loved so much began. Suddenly, a more pronounced noise startled me. It seemed to come from the kitchen. My heart raced, and I froze on the sofa, my eyes wide and fixed on the door leading to the hallway. It must be the fridge, I thought, in a desperate attempt to calm myself. But then I heard it again, a metallic sound like someone rummaging through the silverware drawers. With trembling hands, I grabbed my cell phone. No signal. Of course, I thought bitterly. Just like in all those horror stories, I swallowed hard, realizing that I would have to investigate on my own. Slowly, I rose from the sofa, taking careful steps to avoid making any noise. As I approached the kitchen, the sound became more distinct. It wasn't my imagination. There was someone in there. My heart was pounding so hard I feared the intruder could hear it. With cautious steps, I approached the kitchen door, my fingers tightly gripping the doorframe. The darkness seemed to engulf everything, but I could make out a silhouette moving near the sink. It was undeniably human. I froze, my mind racing through all the scary stories I had ever read. But this wasn't fiction, it was real, tangible, and terrifying. The intruder, seemingly unaware of my presence, continued to rummage through the drawers. The clinking of silverware echoed in the silent kitchen, each sound amplified by my growing fear. I knew I had to act. Staying put wasn't an option. With my heart in my throat, I took a step back, planning to run for the phone in the living room. That's when the wooden floor betrayed my presence with a sharp creak. The movement in the kitchen ceased abruptly. The ensuing silence was deafening. I could hear my own accelerated breathing, and I was certain the intruder could too. For a moment that felt like an eternity, we both stood motionless, like pieces in a macabre chess game. Suddenly, the silhouette moved towards me. Without thinking twice, I turned and ran down the hallway, stumbling in the darkness. Behind me, I heard heavy, rapid footsteps. Those scary stories I had so enjoyed now seemed like a cruel foreshadowing of my fate. My body moved on pure instinct, driven by the fear coursing through my veins. I ran down the dark hallway, my fingers brushing the familiar walls to guide me. The heavy footsteps behind me echoed like thunder, drawing closer. My mind screamed in panic, recalling every horror story I had ever read. I reached the living room, bumping into the sofa in the process. The sharp pain in my leg was ignored amidst the rush of adrenaline. My eyes frantically scanned the room, searching for an escape, a weapon, anything that could help. The phone. I lunged towards the end table, grabbing the device with trembling fingers, but my heart sank as I realized the line was dead. The intruder must have cut the wires. This revelation sent a new wave of terror through me, reminding me of the scary stories where victims were completely isolated from the outside world. I heard a noise coming from the hallway and turned just in time to see a dark figure entering the room. It was a tall man, dressed in dark clothing and a hood that concealed his face. He paused for a moment, as if assessing me, and then advanced, desperate. I grabbed the table lamp and hurled it at the intruder. He dodged, but the object distracted him for a precious second. I seized the opportunity to run towards the front door, my fingers fumbling with the lock in panic. My fingers finally managed to turn the key, and I pulled the door open with a desperate yank. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I barely felt it. Propelled by adrenaline, I ran into the backyard, the damp grass tickling my bare feet, my breath forming white clouds in the chilly air. I glanced over my shoulder and saw the intruder emerging from the house, his silhouette outlined against the light of the living room. He hesitated for a moment, perhaps surprised by my sudden escape. I took advantage of those precious seconds to run towards the street, screaming for help with all my might. The lights in the neighboring houses started to turn on one by one. I heard confused, concerned voices, doors opening. The sound of heavy footsteps behind me faded and then stopped altogether. When I looked back again, the intruder had vanished into the darkness. Minutes later, I was sitting on the neighbor's porch, wrapped in a warm blanket, as the police sirens drew closer. My parents arrived soon after, pale and frightened. Between sobs, I recounted to them and the officers what had happened. The police searched our house and the neighborhood but found no sign of the intruder. In the following days, we installed a security system and reinforced the locks, but the feeling of vulnerability stayed with me for a long time. That night changed my perspective on the horror stories I had so enjoyed. Now I understood the true terror of isolation, the scary reality behind the printed words. But I also learned about my own strength and ability to survive. Today, years later, I still feel a chill when I'm alone at home at night. But instead of paralyzing me, that feeling reminds me of my resilience. The shadows of solitude still exist, but I know I can face them. It was a cold and gloomy Saturday, the kind that seems ideal for mysterious tales of isolation. Kevin Johnson, a 15-year-old teenager, was alone in our modest suburban home. My parents had gone out for the entire day, and my older brother Brian was at work as usual. Solitude didn't bother me. In fact, I relished these moments of tranquility. I settled at the kitchen table, spreading out my books and notebooks to do my homework. The silence was almost tangible, interrupted only by the soft tick-tocking of the clock on the wall. To my left, the narrow hallway stretched like a dark passageway. I knew every corner of that house, but on that day, for some reason, it felt different, almost alien. The diffused light filtering through the scarce windows created a hazy atmosphere, as if the house were enveloped in an invisible mist. It was the kind of setting that would perfectly serve as a backdrop for scary stories of loneliness, but I pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on the task at hand. I spent a few hours immersed in my studies, enjoying the peace and quiet. Time seemed to flow peculiarly when I was alone, and I found myself lost in a world of equations and literary analyses. It was then that something happened that would change everything. At the far end of the hallway to my left, I heard a female voice calling my name. Not just my name, but the childhood nickname only my family used. The sound was crystal clear, piercing the silence like a sharp blade. My blood ran cold, and I felt every hair on my body stand on end. That moment marked the beginning of one of the scariest stories of isolation I would ever experience. My heart raced, pounding so hard I could hear it echoing in my ears. A wave of fear washed over me, freezing me in place. Slowly, I turned my head towards the hallway, dreading what I might see. To my momentary relief, there was nothing there but the familiar shadows. With trembling hands, I closed my books as quietly as possible. My eyes remained fixed on the hallway as I rose, feeling every muscle in my body tense. I grabbed my jacket that was hanging on the chair next to me, putting it on with quick, silent movements. Tears began to well up in my eyes, the fear growing by the second. I knew it was impossible for anyone else to be in the house besides me. My family was the only one with access, and they were all out. Still, the voice had been so clear, so real. These reflections only heightened my terror, turning my experience into one of the most chilling tales of isolation I could imagine. Without looking back, I made my way towards the back door. Each step was careful, my feet barely touching the ground. The silence of the house now felt oppressive, as if something was lurking, waiting to reveal itself. I reached for the doorknob, turning it with utmost care to avoid making any noise. As soon as I stepped outside, the cold air hit me, but it was a relief compared to the terror I felt inside the house. I ran to the detached garage at the back of the yard, my refuge in scary stories of being alone. I sat on my dad's red lawnmower, my eyes fixed on the back door of the house. I stayed there, trembling, for hours watching, waiting, fearing that someone or something would emerge from the house. The hours dragged on as I sat on the lawnmower, my eyes stinging from staring at the back door. The cold from the metal started to seep through my jacket, but I barely noticed, consumed by anxiety. This experience was turning into one of the most intense, scary stories of isolation I had ever lived. Finally, I heard the familiar sound of my parents' car pulling into the garage. An immense relief washed over me, mixed with a desperate urge to tell them what had happened. As soon as they stepped out of the car, I ran towards them, my words tumbling out in a confused torrent. "Kevin, calm down," my mother Sarah said, placing her hands on my shoulders. "Take a deep breath and tell us what happened." Between sobs, I narrated the events of the afternoon. My father David listened attentively, his face a mixture of concern and skepticism. "Let's check the house," he said at last, his voice steady and reassuring. Reluctantly, I followed my parents back inside. Each step felt like stepping back into one of the scary stories of isolation I feared so much. I watched anxiously as they inspected every room, every closet, every hidden corner. As I already knew, they found nothing out of the ordinary. "It must have been your imagination, son," my father concluded, giving me a comforting pat on the back. "Sometimes when we're alone, our minds can play tricks on us." I nodded, wanting to believe him, but a part of me knew that what I had heard was too real to be merely my imagination. That night, lying in my bed, I couldn't sleep. The events of the day replayed in my mind, turning into one of the most disturbing tales of mysterious isolation I had ever experienced. In the days that followed, I tried to rationalize what had happened, but the memory of that clear voice calling my name persisted. I realized that some scary stories of loneliness don't end when we return to the company of others. They stay with us, echoing in our minds long afterward. Years have passed since that terrifying afternoon, but the memory remains vivid in my mind. Now, at 35, I've moved back into the same house to take care of my aging mother, Sarah. My father, David, passed away a few years ago, leaving a void that seems to amplify the echoes of the past. The house, though familiar, still carries with it the atmosphere of the mysterious tales of isolation that marked my youth. Sometimes, late at night, when the silence becomes almost palpable, I feel that familiar chill run down my spine, as if I'm reliving one of the scary stories of loneliness from my teenage years. My mother, with her graying hair and slower steps, often tells me about strange experiences she's been having. "Kevin," she says to me on a particularly quiet night, "sometimes I hear your father calling me from the living room." I feel my heart quicken at her words. "What do you do when that happens, Mom?" I ask, trying to keep my voice calm. "Well, I go in there to see what he wants," she replies nonchalantly. "But when I get there, there's no one. It must be my imagination playing tricks, right?" I nod, unsure of what to say. Part of me wants to tell her about my own experience years ago, but I hesitate. Are we both trapped in our own scary stories of isolation? Or is there something more going on in this house? As the days pass, I begin to question the nature of reality and perception. Can isolation and loneliness truly create such experiences? Or is there something deeper, more mysterious at play? As I care for my mother and navigate these uncertain waters, I realize that some horror stories of being alone never truly end. They just evolve, transform, echoing through time and generations, reminding us that the deepest mysteries often reside within ourselves and the places we call home. If you enjoyed the video you just watched, you won't want to miss this next one. Click now and I'll see you there.